ended up, Will and I, in terms of thinking about what kinds of things could be helpful to dads, about talking to their sons about manhood and masculinity, is the idea that while historically, before the modern age, there was all of the structure around how to kind of communicate what being a man is about, the way in which we've got things going these days doesn't give us something that's built in about that. And so the concept that we came up with was the idea of being able to write a letter to your sons about the kinds of things that are important to you about the kind of man you want them to become. But then the challenge was, okay, how do you write this thing if you're not like a literature major? And that's what this talk is going to be about. And so what I want to do is spend some time, a little bit of time, and talk about what some of the challenges are that our guys face. And frankly, you'll recognize it's also the challenges that we faced as men growing up, as from boys to men growing up ourselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I've got some structure around ideas of how it is that you can go about creating a letter that you can use to communicate to your boys about what it is that you think is important. There's going to be a follow-up to this in a month or so. It's on the calendar. And that's going to be an opportunity for any of the dads who are interested in taking advantage of that to meet together again about this time with your sons. And I've got a presentation for teenage boys about these same struggles. And the presentation goes through the information about what the struggles are, and right at the point in that presentation where would be the place that I would speak about what's important about being a man, that's where I stop, and you have the opportunity to deliver that letter to your son there in that setting for him to read. And the idea about that is the notion about, first of all, kind of setting a framework for this for you, but also it's the communication to our guys that this is not just, while it is a very personal thing between you and your son, it's not just an issue between a dad and their son. This is about an issue from men to young boys about these kinds of issues. So that's going to be an opportunity that's available. The way that one of the things that I found here, let me get this on, is one other thing is that there's going to be information at the end about where you can go and find the handout if anybody's ended up not having one. It's on my website. And then there's all kinds of other stuff there, and I'll have some information about it at the end of the talk today. But I wanted to start out with this cartoon that was Outland, which has been gone for a while now, but I really liked the concept of this. And so here are these guys sitting on the couch saying, hey, how do you know if a woman has been working on a computer? There's whiteout on the screen, and they all burst into laughter. And woman walks up and says, you dumb hypocrites. You mock the half of humanity that makes your graceless existence bearable. Men should pause for one moment and take another long, hard look at the very thing that brings meaning to their meaningless lives. And she walks away. And of course, this is the problem, is that if this is the example about what it is that brings meaning to our meaningless lives, and of course, there's so much more than that. When researchers look at differences between guys and girls, men and women, even today, with all of the kind of opening up of gender expectations and gender roles and the kind of even societal requirements, the broadening of the societal acceptance for men and women to not be so constrained by gender roles, it still turns out that guys and girls start having normative differences in these particular qualities. And so guys show up as being more instrumental, which is more kind of active, hands-on, interacting and engaging directly with the world. more competitive. Their dominance is more of an issue. There's more of territoriality that they express. There's the notion of toughness continues to be a quality that's emphasized and that differentiates guys versus girls, and individuality and independence. And girls show up being more expressive. Group cohesion is more important. Cooperation is more likely and more important. There's much more of a tendency to provide mutual support, and there is a much greater intimacy. So these gender differences continue to exist. And the complication for our guys is that if they get too stuck in these kind of gender expectations that pull them, then they miss out on aspects of their own humanity and the scope of the experiences that they have and need to have a healthy and happy life. They get kind of split off. So what makes that more complicated is the kind of challenges that all of us are facing these days with the changes both in globally in our contact with the folks outside of the United States, but also about the different kinds of competition that's showing up for guys. And so there's problems because the traditional way of being able to fulfill yourself as a man by being dominant and successful and economically viable has problems with the reality that with industrialization first and then with the technological revolution, that the traditional things that establish men as having the ability to, through brute strength and our muscularity, be able to accomplish things disappears. It's intellectual now. And there's no male preference, there's no male opportunity that makes that an advantage. So we've got the industrialization, the technological that then came into that. We've got the global economy, and so you're competing with everybody. You've got a free market economy, which means everything goes, and you don't have a kind of clear role in this. And this is true for women also. But the problem is, if you think about how we define and how there's still this expectation about what men are supposed to be, these are problems about being able to fulfill that sense. And so it's more and more likely that you have more and more of a sense that you can't really do what is traditionally male-like in going about moving through the world. The modern employment model, men and women are working equally side by side. The pace of change, which is overwhelming for everybody. All the aspects of equality, and so you don't have a natural advantage for being male, which has been in place for a long, long time. The sexual revolution, in the sense that there is all kinds of freedoms that have opened up about women having the opportunity and the legitimacy for them pursuing their own sexual agendas just as well as men do. It's a curious thing that I find with teenage boys around this, in that for the longest time, until still relatively recently, even past the feminist revolution and the opening up of sexual mores, to be able to have more freedom to express yourself sexually. Even with that, it's been more recently that girls feel comfortable being more sexually aggressive in pursuing a sexual agenda with guys. And the curious thing is that this is really freaking out a lot of teenage guys, because our guy rules don't give us any practice about when to say no. Because everybody knows that if you have the opportunity to have sex as a guy, you're supposed to have sex. Well, it turns out that's not really true for most of us. But before, you didn't have to think about that, because women held the decision-making about whether sex was going to be engaged in or not. That's changed now. So this is a very subtle thing that's kind of showed up, that's within this whole context of stuff that's happening here. And so how are your sons supposed to make that decision if they're not just going to go with anybody who will do it with me, I'll do it with them? Consumerism, adolescent culture, which means the focus on the energy and the innovation and the breaking of tradition and all of that kind of stuff that goes along with being an adolescent, has been kind of filtered into the culture, which also means there's not a notion about how you start assuming responsibility as an adult man. That in the olden days, like 30 years ago, there was the notion of Peter Pan syndrome, where you just continue to be this kind of kid-like person. Well, we all know the problems with that, either from our own lives or from the lives of other men that we know. But how are our kids supposed to get this notion? The feminist revolution, which is now you're not just competing with other men, you're competing with everybody. Just like with the global economy, you're not competing just with your immediate environment or the United States. You're competing with the world. The modern educational system, which has gotten more and more and more focused on necessarily on the way in which you've got to get information in and continue to kind of build knowledge bases, and extensively so. But it turns out that that doesn't sit well and is not well suited, especially for younger boys who have a more active stance in terms of interacting with the world, and their development makes them more fidgety in classrooms, has a different kind of learning style, especially early on, normatively. But the educational system is designed to have all of us sit in our seats and do this stuff minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day, that kind of stuff. The definition, and what's going to bring us to what I'm going to be talking more about today, which is the costly and contradictory and unattainable definition of manhood. All the things that we're supposed to do and supposed to be a man, which some of which, the traditional notion of that, don't fit with our modern relationships, the opportunity for us to have intimacy and actually be close and vulnerable with another person as a man, which was not the case in the traditional view of manhood. But also about all of the demands about how to kind of figure out what you're going to do as you identify as a man. And then more specifically about no transition to manhood. And that's another aspect of why this letter has for us some potential benefit, because it marks something. So this notion about how you move from being a boy to be a man, historically in cultures, every culture had one of another form of that kind of transition that was marked for men. Our modern cultures do not. Okay, so one of the ways that this happened, and does happen, is the stories that we tell and the kind of examples that exist in these stories of what men, grown men in the framework of some story or some society or in their relationships are. And we've got different examples of that. One of those is the archetypes, which have been around for thousands of years. And so there are pretty much 4 primary archetypes of what being a man is like by the roles that you could fill. And we've got the king and the warrior and the magician and the lover. Our opportunity for our boys limits the ability to fulfill clearly one or another of these roles, except for lover, in a very superficial and constrained way. And we don't have stories that communicate how the king aspect, the person who is in charge and has responsibility and needs to look out for those who are weak and need defended, these archetypes are not really showing up in a definitive way in any of the stories. And we don't have, the beauty of the United States is there is no established way to do any of these things, which gives you the freedom to be able to do things the way that are meaningful to you. But the problem is, we also don't have any pre-established way of identifying these things, and so it can just kind of slide past us. Then there is the various stereotypes that show up, and these still kind of exist. And so the genteel patriarch is really that kind of CEO, the kind of head of a company, that kind of business that fits within that. The heroic artisan is all of the different ways that men have the opportunity and the legitimacy of expressing the side of themselves and accomplishing things. And then the self-made man is, of course, entrepreneurial ism, and the notion that you're supposed to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make your own company and make your own way and that kind of business. A wonderful framework and a great opportunity, but tremendous stress if this is the view of the limitations of what it's going to, these are the different forms of being a man in the modern society. Really limiting is the problem with that. So then we have the different role models. So where are our guys getting the notion about what being a man is like? And so it turns out that there are a number of folks that your sons will look to about what it is that they're supposed to be thinking about, how to become a grown man, and you're sitting right in the middle of being the most influential person for how that comes about. With that in mind, the question then becomes, what is it that our sons need? If we're going to be able to try and help them figure out how to navigate this, because you need to help them navigate how to move from being a boy into a man, then some of the things that are important to appreciate and that ideally would be part of the things that you communicate to them are the kinds of things that are important to everybody. So this is being human. It's like the need to be loved and to love, to have support, to get encouragement, to find meaning and purpose in life, to have joy, to be connected, to be validated as a person, as the individual that you are. And more specifically, what they need in part is going to be a viable definition of what manhood is. And this is where it gets tricky because of the things that I've been talking about, of the kind of frameworks that we have are out of date and really don't fit very well for the modern era, but also modern relationships. And so the idea here is how you be a man rather than appear to be a man. And if you think about it, and as you think about the different kind of ways that mostly are portrayed about how men should be, they're really about posturing and about appearance rather than the core aspect of what that means. And that's where masculine virtues come in. There are all of these rules that we've got. And you can think about those. What are the guy rules for being physical? It's about being muscular. It's about having a large penis. It's about being tough. There's aspects about how you're supposed to interact in social situations, about what's man-like versus girl-like is often the contrast, about how you express intimacy and be in an intimate relationship, about alcohol and drugs, because everybody knows a real man can hold their liquor. Those concepts are out there, and that your boys are exposed to them because we are too. They're still out there. The question that's led to the things we're going to be talking about today is, what are some of the ways that you can start to counter those messages? And again, so we've got the different gender traits, which I'm not going to worry about right now. And the idea that I've given some thought to is about how to take these qualities that are part of what guys still identify with, the independence and the toughness and the dominance, and broaden them out so that you're not just as a guy having to think about purely a sense of independence, which is separate and not connected to other people, but starting to merge that with some of the other qualities that are going to be important. And so from my perspective, that would be that one of the ways to talk about independence is through the concept of confidence. Confidence doesn't require you to separate yourself and be your own person, independent and unconnected to other people. Confidence is something that moves in with it the concept of working with other people. So I've presented these as some ideas for you to think about of how to kind of emphasize some really important virtues for your sons, but not constrain them to those antiquated notions that really don't fit very well in the way in which modern relationships work. Another thing that's important is the recognition that manhood is a legitimate identity to have. The notion that we're going to have a time where there's not going to be your identification as a man or your identification as a woman, it's really hard for me to imagine that that's going to happen, certainly anytime soon, and I mean centuries. And so this concept is important, but the trick of it is not to have that be a separating thing. That it's a thing that is one kind of way in which you identify, but it joins you together so that you're not having to distinguish yourself and create these artificial distances between maleness and femaleness or manhood and womanhood. And the thing that's also interesting about this to me is that girls are just as influential about imposing these separations as guys are. And so there are plenty enough times that if a guy, teenage guy, folks I spend time with, responds in some ways that's not traditionally masculine, they can get as much grief from girls about not being manly enough or being a girl-like as they would get that from guys. And so this notion about what they're struggling with, what your guys are struggling with about how to be, so being intimate and being vulnerable is absolutely critical for a healthy and satisfying and lasting relationship. But guys are not supposed to be like that. This is the kinds of challenges that we have. Another thing that's important that guys need is being able to have the full range of emotional expression, which, when you separate very clearly and distinctively masculine virtues versus feminine virtues, then from the masculine side, we're left out of the intimacy and the more tender emotions, which is a problem for being able to feel satisfied with your life and to be able to enjoy things. Another piece of the puzzle here is about having rites of passage. And rites of passage are crucial because for males, we don't have a defining biological event that establishes our shift from being a child to being an adult. The effects of puberty don't lead us to have a period. The clear definition that the body is ready to be able to have a child and so consequently fulfill an adult role. Men's bodies don't work that way. And so there's this struggling that goes on about how to feel like you've made it to that side of things. So the rites of passage have been a way culturally, historically, except for the modern era, that cultures have made sure there is an event that defines that and makes that clear. And it also includes the notion that this is the point at which you're no longer the person to be taken care of. You now have responsibilities to start being a contributing member of the community. Another really important problem with not having a demarcation of that. When is your kid supposed to start assuming responsibility for things? And so the ways in which that's done historically in cultures is that there's an initiation, there's a challenge to overcome, and there's a need to test themselves, which they then succeed at and come back to the community. And that then makes it clear that they've gone through the process that they need to demonstrate that they're capable of assuming the role of an adult in society, and in this case, an adult man. And then there is also a more informal way of doing that, and that's what we're going to be talking some about if I ever get to the point about the letters, which I'm going to. And so here's just some examples of how it is that we naturally, in the United States and in the West, as men, try and have that sense. And so the way in which you can feel like a man is that you've actually got man parts. But it's also about, it can be driver's license, it can be losing your virginity, drinking and drugging, getting your diploma, 18, 21, hazing, tattoos, piercings, fatherhood, military service. There are these things that we've kind of substituted for a formal presentation and a formal accomplishment of that. And they're also not satisfying. Guys need to have some way to have the sense that they have their own competence, that there are things that they can do, and that's clearly about them being in the role of an adult man to be able to do those things. And so finding ways to make sure that they have accomplishments, that ways that they can distinguish themselves. Lots of times that just happens, but what I'm suggesting to you is that if you keep these in mind, there are things that you can, in the course of your raising of your sons, look for opportunities for this to happen, to put them in to the experiences that y'all have and the experiences that your son has. Another really important thing, which is a particular problem in the West, is, and especially in the United States, is physical contact with men. The boys are hug deprived. Human beings need affection and support and love and physical contact. And so they have to figure out how to do that without being a girl or being a sissy or being a homosexual if you actually just have physical contact. Okay, so here's the thing. While it's not going to be the case that a letter that you write to your son is going to resolve all of these things and in place all of these things, but it does provide an opportunity for you to first take some time yourself and think through what it means to you for your son to make it to playing the role and being a man. And so this is an activity that's as much for you as it is for your son, because it helps you stop and think and clarify this, and then be able to better communicate that, both directly in the form of this letter, but also in terms of knowing about things to start putting into their lives. And so the goals of this is to inspire your guys about what being a man is about and how important that is and how worthy that is as a thing to do. That it also gives guidance about what they're supposed to focus on and how they're going to know about that. And it also, in the way in which I'm going to suggest that you approach this letter, it also is a validating thing, that you're saying these are the things you've already accomplished, and these are the things that are already admirable to me about you. You actually define what manhood is in this. There's a statement of your values, which you live and demonstrate. But because these days our kids don't work next to us, you know, before the modern eras, industrialization and after, our kids were right next to us all day long, working next to us. You didn't have to have conversations about what values you had. You demonstrated them in their presence and required it of them while they were with you. Our lives are arranged differently these days. And so communicating these things becomes important because you don't have as much the opportunity to demonstrate them. And then it also becomes something that your guy can hold on to. That's another particular important thing to me. So the aspects of the letter that are important to keep in mind is that there are developmental considerations. So the kind of letter that you would write to your 8th grade son is different than the kind of letter you would write to your 12th grade son. And so there's some aspects of that that are important. The length of this is that this does not have to be some kind of tome that you kind of bind and print and hand over to them. It's just going to be the highlighting of the things that are important to you. And that's as long or as short as makes sense to you. The idea of how you're going about doing this, in my mind, is that it works best if you write it and then put it aside and then come back to it. So once you get what you like and what you think represents what you want to say, just put it aside and come back to it, because it'll give you a different perspective, and you may then see that there are other things of editing and adjustment you want to do. It's really important, I think, to have somebody else read it, especially your spouse is an important person for that, because especially women have their own views about these things, and taking that into account is important. It's perfectly legitimate. The what about mom aspect of this is that also that y'all write this together. That while you represent masculinity as the man to your son, that doesn't mean that women don't also have views about that and have an influence of that. They most certainly do, and moms do have influence. And so it's not necessary for this to be only from dad. That's the way I'm talking about it, though. It's useful, and I find, for there to be a mix of serious and light rather than just kind of this heavy-duty thing. But again, that depends on your style. If you're a more serious and sober-minded person, that's a legitimate way to do this. It needs to reflect you. That's the importance of it. And making it personal becomes really important, that this is not an academic exercise, that there should be the feeling from you in this communication to your son about the importance of this and their importance to you. Okay, so the actual letter, then, some of the suggestions for that that I have is that you begin the letter with some kind of statement that marks this as what it's supposed to be, which is a really serious communication to your son about some things that are important to you. And that's examples like, you're about to enter the high school now, and there's going to be some things that are going to be important for you to keep in mind, or you'll be facing challenges in life. These are kind of examples of phrases. And you'll find these in the handout, and you'll find these on the website handout also, which is usually a longer version than the one you have here. On the website, there's also various examples of kinds of letters or letter ideas that are on that are not just the structure that I'm talking about today. So giving the notion of kind of entering into and how to start the letter, very important to talk about your love for your son and that you're proud of them, and communicate that so that they get that as part of this whole big picture of why it is that this is important to you and why it is that they're important to you. And that's pretty straightforward, of like, I love you. And there are things that are important to me that I think are going to be important for you to have a healthy and satisfying adult life. And this is going to be some of the stuff you'll talk about. Your son I'm proud of, there are wonderful qualities you have, any number of ways to say that. And then the idea of saying something about why this letter. There are some things that are important to you that you need to be thinking about as you enter into your adult manhood. And these are going to be the things that, to me, are important for you to consider. There are things I want you to know. It's time for you to begin to take on some of the responsibilities of manhood. It's time for you to think about the kind of man you want to be. And if you don't like emphasizing the manhood part about this, adulthood works perfectly fine. It's also legitimate to be more cautious about defining this so clearly as manhood that it's completely distinct from womanhood. But the concept of these virtues are still important. And so even without focusing just on the manhood aspect of this, communicating your values and being clear about what you expect of your son in terms of values becomes really important. For me, what that always means is character. That the thing that the thread that runs through everything is not what you've learned today and not what skill you have that you're starting to build. Those change and shift and adjust, especially these days with how much change occurs in terms of skills and abilities and opportunities. But character is the bedrock. That's the thing that carries you across any situation. And that's what really the core of this is about, is making that clear to your kid about what to you is a man of character. I expect you to be a man of character. You'll be facing a number of challenges. Your mom and I think it's going to be important for you. It is important for you, those kinds of things. And then it comes to the place where you define what being a man of character is about. There's a number of qualities, how you can tell that you are acting more like a man versus like a child. And there's lots of different ways that you can talk about that. Some of the ways you can do that is some of the distinctions between a boy and a man are the roles that they assume. And so you can talk about what being a man is like, but also what being a friend is like, and what being a husband and a father and a son or a member of the family or an employee or a boss or a citizen or neighbor, that these are the things that in these roles, these are what men do versus what boys do. Areas of life like love, when you're a man, this is the way. As you become, these are the things you should be doing. So the different categories of things. This is how you should approach school and work. This is how you should be in a friendship. This is how you be in a partnership, marriage. This is how you should approach and think about sex. Alcohol and drugs, community, the responsibilities that you have for the community. And then it's important to include what men do when they face challenges. You're going to face challenges, and this is the kind of thing that's important for you to be able to do, and this is what I'm expecting you to do when you have these challenges. Another important piece of this, in my mind, is then you talking about the commitment you have to being there for your son. That you're here, I'm with you, this is something we're going to have you go through together. And then to wrap it up with making it absolutely clear about your affection and love and admiration and the importance of your son to you. Many of us don't do that well. Guy rules really interfere with us finding ways or being comfortable with expressing tender affection and love. And many of us adult men know the cost of that. The hole that can start to open up because of that. The things we can end up trying to fill that hole with. This is also about finding ways for you to get a connection with your son that helps him be less likely to end up with an emotional space that needs something to fill it. And that's about you getting close enough with him to be able to provide that with respect to relationships with guys in the form of you as his dad. And then there's a couple of other things like the reality is that very few of us have gone through anything like this. We ourselves had to meander and stumble our way into adult manhood. And so you're thinking, what do I know about this? I kind of pieced it together myself. I don't want you worrying about that. The fact that you had to do that doesn't mean that you are not capable of creating and addressing that with your own son, it can be a little bit difficult at times because it can bring up some stuff about what you realize you didn't have, but that is important and that you missed by not having. But that's part of the beauty of parenthood, is that we get a chance at times to change what our own parenting history was from our parents and make something different for our kids. There's also personal accountability, and what I mean by that is, well, the reason I refer to this is one of the things that was most frustrating to me, a number of things, but as a parent, was the degree to which I couldn't continue to pretend that how I thought or did things was how I was telling myself. I'm an honest, honorable person. Well, kids will identify when you fall short of your own standards and values that you espouse and that you try and communicate to them. And so there is going to be an issue that you've already discovered. If not, you will. And if not, you've got a very nice child who's happy to keep it to himself because they've noticed that you haven't quite lived the values that you've been requiring of them. And the problem is it's really difficult to confront that. So that's going to be a part of being clear about this, is that it requires you to then address the issue of whether you're going to be accountable to the same values and those kinds of things. It's really important more than anything else. This is just one form, this letter thing is just one form of it, about you being present in your child's life. That you be there, that you make a connection, and that you reach out and try and establish and maintain a connection with them. It's really important for you to be hopeful and positive. It's very easy, especially these days, to be cynical and to be pessimistic. And it turns out that the data and the stats on kids are wonderful. Kids are doing better than they've been almost since they've been collecting data on how kids are doing. You wouldn't know this, but it turns out that this generation of kids has more positive signs for all the indications for premarital sex, for unwanted pregnancies, for alcohol and drug use. The peak of alcohol and drug use in the United States was 1978, and it's gone down ever since. You would know this from the stats. But alcohol and drug use is lower than it was in 78. Okay. Still a problem if you've got a kid who's using, but I'm just telling you, it's not so bad out there. And so, and your kid also needs to know this, because we're inundated with all of the information that's designed to get our attention through the media and the internet, and that means it's either about violence or about sex, because that's what orients human beings. And so to get your attention, that's what everything's going to be focused on. And then we've got, as I was saying, this is an old date, but the letter ceremony is going to be coming up, and there will be an announcement for that. A hug is always nice, and so even though you may have to structure it so that it's not uncomfortable. So on my website, drjameswellborn.com, if you'll go to the public speaking page and then go to the the Measure of a Man, you'll see down here the handout for the presentation, that kind of thing. I also have on my website a survey place that you can go and do that, and then there's a whole bunch of different things. My website, the Dr. James Wellborn website, has most of the things that I write like blogs and articles and that kind of business. And most of that is about parenting. And so there's a lot of stuff about parenting. I actually have a book that I've written on parenting, although I always forget, like today, to have brought that, so it's not here, but you can get a hold of that in many different formats. And then there's various things about that. That's what I have to say today. I'm going to leave it open for questions. I'm here and can talk as long as you want to. And so we're done officially. You can get up and wander and go to work or run for the doors. So thanks so much for having me out. I appreciate it.